Imagine you wake up one morning and your country doesn't exist yet. You go to sleep that same night and it does. Then you wake up the next morning and it's already gone. Not conquered slowly, not dissolved over decades of bad politics and worse coffee. Gone in 36 hours. That is not a metaphor. That is not a thought experiment. That actually happened to real people in 1939 in a tiny mountain-wedged slice of Europe called Carpatho-Ukraine, and almost nobody on Earth has ever heard of it. So today, we are going to fix that. Pull up a chair. This story has everything. Desperate nationalists, a guy who was president for literally one day, Hungarian tanks, a parliament that met exactly once, a national anthem nobody had memorized yet, and a level of historical bad luck so spectacular it borders on performance art. Let's go. First, geography, because you need to understand where this place even was, because I promise you it is not where you think it is. Picture Central Europe in the late 1930s. Czechoslovakia exists. That proud, democratic, slightly awkward rectangle of a country sandwiched between Germany and everyone else's anxiety. Now look at the very eastern tip of Czechoslovakia. It juts out like an afterthought, like someone was drawing the map and sneezed right at the end. That little sneeze of land, that's Carpatho-Ukraine. It was also called Ruthenia or Sub-Carpathian Rus, depending on who you asked and how much trouble you wanted to start at a dinner party. The people who lived there were called Rusins, a Slavic ethnic group who were, depending on the century and whoever had recently invaded, considered Ukrainian or Russian or their own distinct thing entirely. They were mountain people, tough, Orthodox churching, sheep-herding, incredibly stubborn mountain people who had spent centuries being ruled by the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and before that by other empires, and before that by frankly whoever felt like showing up that week. By the time they ended up inside Czechoslovakia after World War I, they were used to not being entirely in charge of their own fate. What they were not used to, what nobody had really prepared them for, was getting a country, even briefly, even accidentally, even for 36 hours. Here's how it happened. In 1938, Adolf Hitler decided he wanted the Sudetenland, the German-speaking western chunk of Czechoslovakia. Britain and France, in one of history's most spectacular acts of hoping the problem would go away if you didn't look at it directly, let him have it. The Munich Agreement, September 1938, widely considered the world's most elegant political disaster. But when you start pulling at a thread, the whole sweater unravels. Slovakia, the other big piece of Czechoslovakia, said, "Actually, we'd like some autonomy now, please." And Carpatho-Ukraine, watching all of this, tucked in their mountains with their sheep and their churches, said, "You know what? Us too." And so Czechoslovakia, crumbling in real time, said, "Fine, fine, take your autonomy, take it. We're a little busy being dismembered right now." And so in late 1938, Carpatho-Ukraine became an autonomous region within what was now the hyphenated, hanging by a thread entity called Czechoslovakia. They got their own government, they got a prime minister named Augustin Voloshin, a 65-year-old priest, educator, and passionate Ukrainian nationalist who had spent decades writing textbooks and dreaming of something exactly like this. He was, by all accounts, a deeply serious man operating in a completely unserious situation, which is honestly the most heroic kind of person there is. Voloshin's government started doing government things. They declared Ukrainian the official language. They started organizing a small national militia called the Carpathian Siege, young, mostly untrained, extremely enthusiastic men who wore uniforms and believed very hard in their nation. They held elections. They made plans. They had hope, which, in hindsight, was the most dangerous thing of all.
Now here is where the plot accelerates to a speed that should not be physically possible for geopolitics. March 14th, 1939. Slovakia declares full independence. Czechoslovakia, the hyphenated compromise, is now officially dead. There is no more Czechoslovakia. There is just territory, pieces. And in Berlin, Adolf Hitler summons Czech President Emil Hácha to a meeting that can only be described as an offer he was physically prevented from refusing. Hácha literally fainted at some point during negotiations, had to be revived by Hitler's personal doctor, and then signed Bohemia and Moravia over to German control. The Czechs didn't fight. They couldn't. It was over in hours. Meanwhile, in Carpatho-Ukraine, Voloshin and his cabinet are watching all of this happen and doing the political math. The math is not good. Their protector, Czechoslovakia, no longer exists. Hungary, their neighbor to the west, who had been eyeing Carpatho-Ukraine like a man staring at someone else's sandwich, had already received a chunk of their territory in the Vienna Award of 1938, and now Hungary was mobilizing. Actually mobilizing. Troops, tanks, the whole thing. Hungary wanted the rest of Carpatho-Ukraine, and with Czechoslovakia gone, there was nobody left to say no. So what does Voloshin do? Does he surrender? Does he negotiate? Does he quietly pack his bags and retire to somewhere with better geopolitical stability, like, I don't know, a fire swamp? No. Augustin Voloshin, 65-year-old priest and educator, declares independence. March 15, 1939. While German troops are marching into Prague, while the world is reorienting itself around a new and terrible reality, the Parliament of Carpatho-Ukraine meets. Once. They meet once. They declare the independent Republic of Carpatho-Ukraine. They elect Voloshin as president. They pass a constitution. They choose blue and yellow as their national colors, the colors of Ukraine, the nation they saw themselves as part of, the nation that didn't yet exist as a country, but felt more real to them than any empire ever had. And then, and this is important, this is the detail that breaks your heart a little, they broadcast a radio message to the world, to anyone listening. They said, "We exist. We are a country. We are here. Please help us." Nobody came. Well, that's not entirely true. The Carpathian Siege, those young militia volunteers, they were there. Thousands of them had flooded into the capital, Hust. They set up defensive positions. They were armed with rifles, some of which were good, and enthusiasm, all of which was genuine. Against them, the Royal Hungarian Army, which had tanks, actual tanks, and artillery, and vastly superior numbers. The Hungarian invasion had begun on March 15th, the same day independence was declared. The same day. They didn't even have time to print the stamps. What followed was one of the most lopsided military engagements in a century full of lopsided military engagements. The Carpathian Siege fought. This is worth saying clearly, because it would have been understandable, completely understandable, if they hadn't. They were outgunned. They were outnumbered. They had no air force. They had no allies. Germany, which Voloshin had somewhat desperately hoped might intervene on their behalf, given that Germany had just, eaten the rest of Czechoslovakia, Germany just let it happen. Hitler had already promised Hungary they could have Carpatho-Ukraine. It was a side deal, a footnote. 36 hours of human hope traded away in a meeting nobody wrote songs about.
The siege fighters died at checkpoints and in mountain passes and in the streets of Hust. Some of them were teenagers. Some of them had only had their uniforms for a few weeks. They fought anyway. Historians estimate somewhere between 400 and 5,000 people died in the defense of a country that would cease to exist before the week was out. The numbers are uncertain because nobody was keeping great records, which is itself a kind of tragedy. When you're erased, even your losses get erased with you. By March 16th, the next day, it was over. Hungarian forces occupied the entire territory. Voloshin fled, first to Yugoslavia, then eventually to Prague, where he continued teaching and writing and being a deeply serious man in a world that had decided seriousness wasn't enough. He was eventually arrested by the Soviet NKVD in 1945, taken to Moscow, and died in prison. The exact cause of his death was never properly documented. He was 71. He had been president of a country for approximately 1 day. The Carpathian siege soldiers who survived were captured, and many were executed. The territory was absorbed into Hungary, and then after World War II into the Soviet Union, and it is today part of Western Ukraine, which means that the thing Voloshin dreamed of, Ukrainian identity, Ukrainian statehood, eventually became real. Just not in time to save him, not in time to save them. Here is what I want you to sit with, because I think this story is genuinely worth sitting with. Carpathia-Ukraine existed for 36 hours. And in those 36 hours, real people made real decisions. They voted, they declared, they fought, they died. None of it was naive. They knew the odds. Voloshin knew. The siege volunteers knew. They did it anyway, because sometimes a people decides that even an impossible gesture is better than no gesture at all. Even a country that lasts a day is better than never having been a country. There's something almost absurdly human about this. We love to tell stories about great nations, long histories, empires that span centuries. But there's something just as meaningful, maybe more meaningful, in the story of people who had 36 hours and used every single one of them. History is full of countries that shouldn't have worked, but did, and it's full of countries that should have worked, but didn't get the chance. Carpathia-Ukraine is the second kind. It was a country made of stubbornness and priests and young men in borrowed uniforms, standing in mountain passes against tanks. It lasted from one sunrise to the next. And if you had asked Augustin Voloshin, standing in that parliament on March 15, 1939, knowing what was coming,
whether it was worth it. I think he would have looked at you very steadily, in the way that 65-year-old men who have spent their lives believing in something look at you, and said yes, obviously yes, what else would you have us do? The country lasted 36 hours. The memory, if we choose to keep it, lasts a lot longer than that.